Our core mission as an administration and as a country has to be, yes, putting people back to work, but also rebuilding an economy where that work pays off.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
Maybe if I give him this and what he wants, maybe I will come out of this alive. And I did.
Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French and hope you everybody had a great weekend here, and thanks for joining us this Monday, July 9th. A lot to cover in the next 60 minutes, but first up, those middle-class tax cuts. If the president gets his way, the Bush-era tax cuts, they'll stay on the books for everybody in this country making less than $250 grand a year. That's about 98% of us, if not even a little more. Republicans, they say, not so fast. They think everybody, regardless of income, ought to have those tax cuts extended. Like I said, even millionaires and beyond. So I want to ask you, who has got the right recipe here when it comes to tax cuts and equity? And coming up next, Election Incorporated. You have Aetna by any chance insurance? Did you know that they funneled more than $3 million last year alone to an American Action Network? It's a right-leaning group that spent millions fighting Obamacare. Well, tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden impact on money in politics, and sure, it's always been around, but you won't believe how pervasive it's gotten. And later, votes to nowhere. Now, just because your kids are goofing off this summer doesn't mean that Congress ought to do the same. Congressional calendar, it might look busy this summer, but we're going to show you tonight how they're spinning their wheels, and they know it, wasting everybody's time and your tax dollars with bills that will go nowhere. And then, unprocessed justice. Our special investigation earlier this year showed how evidence that could help put alleged rapists behind bars sometimes just ends up sitting around collecting dust in police storage rooms. Well, tonight we have an update on that story, and we'll hear exclusively from one woman, a victim of rape, who's trying to make sure it doesn't happen anymore. It's all coming up on this edition of RFL, but let's begin with the president's announcement today when it came to tax cuts. And our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, he's in first position with the very latest. Andrew?
And Rich, stop me if you've heard this before. President Obama pushing again today his plan to extend tax cuts for the middle class, but he wants tax cuts for those earning more than $250,000 a year to expire. Both the president and presumptive Republican nominee Mitt Romney are out courting the middle class vote, but who's doing a better job of it and who's got the right remedy for our ailing economy? Today at the White House, President Obama was in full campaign mode.
I've cut middle-class taxes every year that I've been president by $3,600 for the typical middle-class family.
Surrounded by middle-class voters, the president reiterated his call for Congress to extend for another year the Bush-era tax cuts for Americans who make less than $250,000. These tax cuts are set to expire at the end of the year unless Congress acts.
Millions of American families, including these good-looking people behind me, could see their taxes go up by $2,200 starting on January 1st of next year. And it would be a drag on the entire economy.
Which doesn't need any more dragging. June was another month of slow job growth, and the president is running out of time to benefit from any turnaround before Election Day. So the renewed focus on these tax cuts looks like an attempt by his campaign to shift the focus onto Mitt Romney.
Mitt Romney, with his wealth and his bank accounts in foreign places, is not the kind of guy that understands the middle class.
Romney supports extending the tax cuts for all income levels. His campaign says the president's plan amounts to a massive tax increase.
My opponent will fight to keep them in place. I will fight to end them.
But for as much debate as there is on tax policy, there's also a divide within the president's own party. Some top Democrats say those tax cuts should be extended for all Americans earning up to $1 million. So the president with a difficult sell to make over the next few months. Rich?
All right, Andrew, let's bring on our table on this. We're joined on set by T.J. McCormick, conservative radio talk show host, and Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. It's all about messaging. Some could say semantics here, but when it gets down to it, Andrew, I'll start with you. There's a real cost here because everybody says government's too big, we can't spend money we don't have. Is there a difference here between giving everybody a tax cut and giving it only to those who make less than 250 grand a year?
Well, you're talking about billions of dollars every year that comes in to the federal government. And the argument for Republicans is that that money, if it's left in the hands of top earners, can then be used to reinvest in the economy. However, that is money that would absolutely not be coming into Washington as part of the tax receipts, so that's less money that the federal government would have either for spending on job creation or individual programs, or to use to offset the debt.
And not only that, but we're going to fights coming up here. We'll get into later in the program, stuff like military spending, et cetera. So we'll get into it. TJ, where do you think the public's going to fall on this? Nobody likes to raise taxes here, but you have an undercurrent that's going to be a big theme throughout this election.
Sure.
Have-nots. Everybody feels, especially with the crash in 08 and what's happened since, the wealthy have only gotten wealthier here. Who's doing a better job of messaging?
Well, first of all, I think right now the Obama team is doing a great job of messaging. Then again, that's like comparing me to Michael Jordan at basketballing. The Romney machine is absolutely just one of the worst communications teams. Anyway, specifically about the taxes, I think it's about optics. I think it's about what people are going to feel like walking in to that voting booth on Election Day. And you know what? It strikes a lot of people as it just doesn't make a lot of sense to be raising taxes on anybody. And to my way of thinking, I think a lot of people are wondering exactly how does raising taxes on the wealthy create a job? All right, and I'm not saying that I'm saying this is what I think mainstream Americans, especially street-level conservatives, how does raising taxes on somebody create a job? And also, where is the president's plan in terms of that? He stands there and talks about fairness, taxing through fairness. But that's
tempered a little bit by the fact that Americans have heard this debate every year for the last 4 years. So I think when you say raising taxes on some people, on anybody, people know what that means. They know that it's 98 versus 2% in this case.
Right? Dom, for me, isn't there going to be an argument to say, wait a minute, I've heard you can't do this because if you do, they won't hire anybody. And they said, for the last 4 years, what did I miss? We kept extending these tax cuts for the top end, record levels, and they're still not hiring. And they said, well, if you don't extend it, we may not hire. And they said they've heard this before. And also, when you go through history, just use Republican presidents. I mean, under Reagan, they paid about 15% more than they're paying now. So even if they raise it to what they paid in 2000 under Clinton, how's this going to play out, you think?
Well, how it's going to play out exactly, Richard, is absolutely nothing is going to happen right now or before the election. So Americans shouldn't really worry or be satisfied at the president's announcement. And two, the two parties can't agree on anything. So who knows how this is going to play? But in terms of who reaches the most people, according to what the president said today, if his tax cut affects 98% of Americans, and in his words, 97% of job creators, well, that's most of the country.
But Dominic's absolutely right. This is about political positioning and coming up with a clear divide between the two parties. None of what we're talking about with this tax plan is going to become reality, at least not this year.
If you could show, there's about $60 billion difference here between the two different plans here, giving it to everybody and then keeping it. If you could show what that $60 billion could buy, whether it's paying down the debt, as conservatives have been screaming that they need to do here, or whether it's to keep a couple military bases open, or to keep X number of cops on the streets or whatever, I think, when we're talking optics and imagery, I think that people say, wait a minute, what would the money buy? Or when have we ever done tax cuts at a time of war in this country? Never until now.
The money would last not much more than about 8.5 days. It's $60 billion. Think about it. When you said $60 billion, I said, I hadn't heard that in a couple.
But TJ, though, that's
nothing.
But that is the classic having it both ways from the conservative side, because they scream every time anything's going to be extended, find me the offsets. Remember?
Yeah,
every single time the Democrats want to spend money on something, you're going to have to find money to pay for it somewhere else, including some programs like aid to pregnant women or whatever. First, find me the offsets. Now, all of a sudden, we're giving tax cuts with money we don't have, and they don't want to hear about it.
Well, you know what? The president gave how many millions of dollars to Brazil to up their oil production? How many millions did we just now send to Egypt for something? I tuned out by the time after I saw the dollar amount. Look, again, this is a small amount of money that's going to be raised by raising these taxes. I still don't know how it's going to. And by the way, let's all keep this in the proper perspective.
I'll give you an idea, TJ, because we got to take a break. We talk about where the money's going to go into the top end, and in terms of corporations' interest in this election, well, we're going to keep that conversation going, including our question online. Go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Richard French Live. Sound off on the question. Two different plans here when it comes to tax cuts. Basically, Republicans want everybody to keep that tax cut going, including the wealthiest among us. And the president says everybody gets it but the top 2%. What do you think? You can sound off on who's got the fairest plan, and you can also tweet us as well. We're going to read those comments in an upcoming episode.